I really appreciate your having me today. If you're like me or most people I know, you're obsessed with the news these days. So I hope what I'm covering is not too basic. Mick has agreed to monitor the chat channel. So any questions you have, please feel free to post them. The more interactive we make this, the more useful it'll be for you, I hope. And my colleague Johnny is running the slides. And so I'll just ask him to pop up the first most obvious slide. So it's no one's surprise that we're talking about the inauguration and the new administration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So even though it's really obvious and to anyone, I did want to spend some time just talking about the backgrounds of these two individuals. Joe Biden's a lawyer. He's got local government experience, and notably, he was elected, I think the second youngest senator ever at the time, to the Senate in 1972. He invested his career in the Senate in both the Foreign Relations and Judiciary committees. So those are two domains in which he's got incredibly deep expertise. Even so far as having intimate relationships with foreign leaders as a result of his position on Foreign Relations Committee, but also, of course, the confirmation process, which you'll have to lean on to get his judicial and other nominees through the Senate. Of course, he was vice president for 8 years and had a variety of responsibilities in that capacity. But he led the recovery board. He led the group that was overseeing response to the economic recovery that was happening just when he assumed the office of the vice presidency. He not only oversaw the distribution of that funding, but made a particular priority of ensuring that we minimized waste, fraud, and abuse in the process. And because of the transparency over that spending, it's generally credited with having seen a historically low amount of waste. He's got a large network of folks with deep experience in government, starting with Ron Klain, his chief of staff, who was his counsel on the Senate Judiciary and chief of staff when he was vice president. So he's got a large bench of folks to draw from as he staffs his new administration. Kamala Harris has less of a history, of course. She was district attorney in San Francisco, attorney general for California. So she was elected to statewide office in one of the largest states in the country. And then, of course, she was senator and served in the Homeland Security and Government Affairs, Intelligence, Judiciary, and Budget committees, for areas which will serve her well as she assumes her responsibilities. So Dan was mentioning how much has happened and how much is happening. If we can go to the next slide, the Biden-Harris administration has to get thousands of individuals on the field in the administration. And this side simply shows the number of folks in the cabinet who've been nominated, who've had a hearing, and who've been confirmed. So while we were preparing for this session, Antony Blinken was confirmed as Secretary of State, and he joins Janet Yellen at Treasury, Lloyd Austin at Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence as the only 4 individuals confirmed by the Senate to join the Biden administration. There are dozens of other members of the administration who've been nominated, and hundreds, if not thousands, of others who've been appointed to political positions that don't require Senate confirmation. So there are Biden-Harris loyalists who've assumed a bunch of positions across the government in an acting capacity or in a full-time position that doesn't require confirmation. This was a major priority during the transition. The Biden administration wanted to make sure it got its team on the field as quickly as possible. One of the things of note is that positions like the Securities and Exchange Commissions and the CFPB, those are agencies that the president-elect at the time waited to see what happened in the Senate to make some nominations. So Gary Gensler and Rohit Chopra were of the progressive variety that would have had a much tougher time getting through a Republican majority Senate. But you saw some enhanced courage on the part of the president-elect in selecting those individuals once the Democrats got the majority in the Senate. So if we could go to the next slide, President Biden has said, and I'm sure you've heard, that he's got 4 main priorities. The first is responding to the pandemic. The second is helping the economy recover. The third is dealing with climate change. And the fourth is improving our record on diversity and inclusion. So there's been a flurry of activity in the last several days in the areas that the president-elect has set are his priorities. With respect to responding to the pandemic, he's issued a 100-day mask challenge. He has re-engaged with the World Health Organization, and he's created a unified national response under the coordination of Jeffrey Zients, one of his colleagues in the Obama administration, and is making increasingly aggressive commitments to improve the distribution of vaccines. He has also taken a number of executive actions in the area of economic recovery. He extended economic and foreclosure moratorium, extended the student loan pause. He's also proposed a pretty ambitious $1.9 trillion COVID response package, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail in a minute. With respect to climate change, of course, the administration has rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. He has put a cessation on all regulatory activity across the government and has begun to repeal a number of environmental regulations and actions that took place during the Trump administration, one of which is to halt construction of the Keystone pipeline. With respect to racial equity, the president has recently announced sort of a whole of government initiative to ensure the administration is looking at the data, ascertaining where the government's programs are either not addressing or exacerbating racial or economic divides, so that it can focus on ensuring that those gaps don't persist, that those racial inequities are addressed. The president, of course, has taken a number of actions on immigration, reinstituted protection of dreamers, those who came to America as undocumented immigrants while younger, ceased wall construction, relaxed some immigration controls. Those are just a number of the things that would fall under that category. I mentioned the COVID response legislation. So even before the inauguration, the president released details of his COVID response. He said when Congress and President Trump were negotiating the most recent COVID response that his first priority would be getting another one enacted. So $1.9 trillion is a staggering amount of money, and some in Congress are wincing at having to do another such enormous bill. But the chances of it getting enacted grew exponentially once the Democrats won control of the Senate. Key elements of that bill: a $1,400 a person stimulus payment, enhanced unemployment insurance, aid to state and local governments, a boost for coronavirus vaccination and testing efforts, aid to schools, child care providers, and renters. So again, a massive bill. Some are suggesting that in payments to individuals too big, not targeted. It'll be a challenge to get that through a 50-50 Senate, but nonetheless, I expect some sort of stimulus to be enacted here in the next 6 weeks or so. Of course, not mentioned here is a lot of the tax reform that was discussed during the presidential campaign. And like with economic response, a Democratic majority in the Senate makes it easier, not easy, but easier to get Biden's tax plan through. Senator Wyden's control of the Senate Finance Committee, joining his Democratic counterparts in the House, makes that just a little bit, maybe a lot more likely. So what they'll try to do is repeal recent tax reform or tax reductions for high income earners, imposing a higher Social Security payroll tax for individuals with wages over $400,000, increase the corporate income tax to 28%, establish a corporate minimum tax on book income, and then temporarily increasing the generosity of the child tax credit and dependent credit, some of which you'll find in the coronavirus response. So a lot of ambitious things going on. If you'll go to the next slide, Johnny, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but winning a Democratic majority in the Senate means a great deal to the chances that even the more progressive elements of the president's proposals get enacted. With Democrats winning both runoff elections in Georgia, Democrats now have 50 seats in the Senate, and with Kamala Harris holding the vice presidency, she casts the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, giving the Republicans a majority. Of course, a lot of attention has been paid to the need to enter into a power-sharing agreement. Even though Democrats have a majority by one, they've got to come to an arrangement how they're going to run the place so that Kamala Harris doesn't have to sit in that chair and cast every single tie-breaking vote. Then Senate Majority Leader McConnell tried to force Senator Schumer to agree not to undo the legislative filibuster. So, as you may know, during the Obama administration, the Democrats did away with the nomination filibuster, which means that it could get nominations through under a simple majority, unlike legislation, which required a 2/3 majority. So Senator McConnell tried to ensure that that agreement, the legislative filibuster, survived. Having gotten 2 Democratic senators to say they wouldn't support doing away with the legislative filibuster, he was able to relinquish his hold on the power sharing agreement just today. And so they can go ahead and organize. It was kind of weird, even though the Democrats had a majority in the Senate, because they hadn't reorganized committees under the new power sharing agreement. The Republicans still chaired those committees. Well, after today, they can go ahead and reorganize under this new agreement, and Democrats will chair the committees, but they'll chair it with a 50-50 split Democrat-Republican. It means that it's going to be hard to get legislation or nominations through those committees without bipartisan support, but it nonetheless means that Democrats get to set the agenda for the committees, which is important for a whole host of reasons, not least of which it means that they'll determine what legislation and nominees are considered by those committees. The blue wave that never materialized means that the House is likewise at a much slimmer majority than expected. And though things go easily through the House, the Speaker is going to have to be really careful to ensure that she pays attention to her far left and her more conservative Democrats to ensure she doesn't lose those critical few votes she needs to get votes through the House. So if we can go to the next slide, the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm glad we're not in person, you might have thrown tomatoes at me, but it's not too soon to start thinking about the next election because it will guide how people vote. The Republicans generally should be favored to pick up seats in a midterm election during a president's first term. But they're in a tough spot. They've got 20 senators up for re-election compared to 14 Democrats. There are what we'd say are 5 targets those Democrats think they have a strong chance of picking up: Florida, Iowa, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I would say Rob Portman's announcement yesterday that he wasn't going to run for re-election means that you might add Ohio to that list. But you can also consider some seats held by Republicans where President Trump has said he will work very hard to get incumbents a primary candidate to oppose them. And you can look to a state like Alaska, where Lisa Murkowski had some disagreements with the president as just one of those. So you can see when I prepared these slides, the list was 5. It may have grown to 6 or 7 just in the last 24 hours. Democrats, on the other hand, have some pretty tough spots. They're going to have a hard time keeping that seat in Georgia and that seat in Arizona, but Colorado and Nevada are likewise generally close. So they're not without their own targets, and who knows what happens between now and Election Day. But it's just an important thing to monitor as things move on, because some of these tight races add to the tightness of the Senate majority. So again, those are some high-level impressions and observations I've got about how things are going. I'd be eager to open up the discussion and Mick, see if we've got any good questions, or if you and I just want to converse.
Okay, right. Just to remind everybody, if you want to ask a question, feel free to write it into the chat, and we can get that asked of Robert. I guess while we're waiting here, we don't have any in there right now, Robert. But let me ask you one thing. You kind of briefly touched on at the beginning with the judicial. The judicial appointments were big in the last administration. How does that look for Biden's administration this one, or is it really more focused on the economic and the 4 items you mentioned in that one slide?
So there'll invariably be vacancies in the throughout the judicial branch that will need to be refilled. Some in the Democratic Party are urging older members of the Supreme Court, for instance, to retire so that they can ensure a majority Democratic Senate gets a chance to confirm those potential vacancies. They'll likewise have vacancies across the judicial branch that they'll have to fill. And Democrats will likely be able to get those through pretty easily, given their majority in the Senate. It won't be a slam dunk. There might be more controversial members, and this is where some nominees with more controversial backgrounds, should the Republicans persuade a Murkowski or a Manchin to support them in opposition, then they would have a tough time. So I think you'll see that means you'll tend to see more mainstream candidates nominated for the judiciary. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's great.
I mean, it was a major priority for the Trump administration and Majority Leader McConnell in particular. So I don't think you'll see that level. It's just going to be harder to envision that many vacancies occurring in this term.
Perfect. One of the questions that just came through, Robert, is maybe some clarification regarding Georgia and their senatorial election that we just went through. I think that why is there another senatorial election after we just went through the runoff and that just happened here in 21 that kind of gave the Democrats their minority? So I guess maybe some clarification on that one.
Yeah, I'm tired too. Raphael Warnock filled an unexpired term. And so he's only got 2 years left in that term, after which he's got to be reelected to a full term. Does that help?
I think that explains it. I guess we'll find out if another question comes through regarding it.
Yeah.
One of the other questions out here is you had the one slide talking about the cabinet nominees. And
Johnny, you want to pull that up?
Yeah.
Yep.
I guess if we added another column to the cabinet nominees that kind of show empty roles from the previous administration, how many cabinet positions are open and how can this impact the decision-making process?
Yeah, well, they're all open because political appointees are obligated to resign upon the inauguration of a new president. But it's true that in the previous administration, there were an unprecedented number of individuals serving in an acting capacity. And you can only really do that under the law for a limited period of time. And, then candidate Biden made a big deal out of so many individuals in acting capacities. I think there'll be a priority of putting Senate confirmed individuals in these and other sub-cabinet positions. But every president runs into frustrations when it tries to get his appointments through the Senate. So I think there's hope. It's a principle of good government that you want the benefit of advice and consent of the Senate when you have individuals in these positions. But should the president run into roadblocks, I would envision, especially as you get later in the term, the number of people in acting capacities creeping up. But as of right now, you've got 100% of the cabinet positions with nominees. I don't think any of them, maybe with the exception of the Office of Management and Budget, maybe SEC and CFPB running into some trouble. But, again, with the Democrats with such a strong majority and generally we're in the honeymoon phase, I would expect to see a pretty good percentage of these nominees getting confirmed pretty soon. As the sub-cabinet gets nominated, depending on the stripe, whether these are of the really progressive variety or more middle of the road, that's when you'll see whether or not we're getting the whole field confirmed by the Senate. Hope that helps.
So, Robert, I asked you a question earlier on the Supreme Court, and you kind of talked about, if the Republicans are able to get some people retire, and it's not the same as what it was under Trump. I got a couple of follow-up questions here from the group. One is about the likelihood of kind of packing the Supreme Court, but I think that's somewhat depending on who they get to retire or whatever. And then the other question is, it says Biden tried to deflect / didn't answer the idea of expanding the Supreme Court. Now that they kind of control two of the three branches, is that a possibility out there from that standpoint? So kind of coming back to the judicial.
Yeah, it seems to me that's the nuclear option. The president has made a lot of trying to bring unity and bipartisanship to Washington. This would not be consistent with that. And I haven't heard a lot about the idea of expanding the number of members of the Supreme Court. So I would be surprised to see that pick up steam. But you've got some important milestones coming up that are going to determine the tone over the next several years. One of which is the nominees, one of which is COVID response, one of which is going to be other important legislative activities like tax reform, infrastructure, to see just what the tone is. If things fall apart, I wouldn't be surprised then to see us pick up something like that. But right now, I see a lot of talk of that having waned.
I guess switching back to the executive branch, Robert, one of the questions in here is during the Trump administration, there were a number of executive orders that were signed, even under Obama. Sounds like Biden's doing is starting out with a number of executive orders. I guess the question was a little bit of clarity is like, what are the checks and balances with these executive orders? And is there a limit to how many you can do from a presidential standpoint?
That's a really good question. I worked on a couple of executive orders, and they were always really hard to get done. So during the Obama administration and the Biden, and now the Biden and the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration, I'm surprised at just how many are able to get done. And frankly, the legal scrutiny that's been applied to some of those executive orders was not what I suffered when I was in the Bush administration. You really did have to ensure that those executive orders would survive a legal test. And that's the check, really. If someone sues to enjoin the implementation of an executive order, a court can decide whether or not it's constitutional or whether it's consistent with some other law. An executive order is law, but it's like the lowest form of law. It can be repealed with the stroke of a pen, and it can't be consistent with any other existing law, including the Constitution or just United States Code. Many of the executive orders you've seen coming out of the Biden administration are simply repealing executive orders that were instituted during the Trump administration. Much of the text of the executive orders is, I'm sure, really important to someone, but what I would call surplusage. It states a principle, creates a group that's going to look at X, Y, Z. It instructs cabinet secretaries to do this, that, or the other thing. That's not just sort of making sure or inventorying things, getting ready to do stuff. They're a little softer. But it is a troubling pattern that in order to circumscribe the legislative branch, the executive branch takes its own action. I don't see it waning. But again, the judicial branch is the check that can ensure it doesn't get out of hand. And you saw that in the Trump administration and in the Obama administration. Individuals could sue to enjoin implementation of the executive orders. And that worked in a lot of cases.
Good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think the next group of questions here, Robert, is a little bit I have the same question. So what is the purpose of the impeachment, and where's it kind of going right now from that, standpoint? As far as, I think there was some talk of the House sending over the articles, was it yesterday or today? I guess, what's your view on the impeachment and purpose
Yeah.
and where we're going with
So you really want to keep this bipartisan, Mick?
it?
What is the purpose of impeachment? I mean, there are individuals who passionately believe that the president and his supporters incited the violence that resulted in the attack on the Capitol. There are others among the group who supported impeachment that I believe they see an opportunity to take political advantage. The the Biden administration, probably is a little concerned that a focus on impeachment distracts the Congress from working on what it really needs it to work on, which is COVID response, economic response, and getting the nomination process underway. Because I was always bad at math, but I don't see the numbers playing out in a way that produces another conviction. So it becomes a political act. Again, really important to a lot of people, probably a political maneuver for another subset of that group. I think it'll simply, like objecting to electors, I think it'll simply delay the inevitable. And so it's just, and now that the House has done it, though, under the rules of the Congress, it has to take place. Technically speaking, the Senate is not allowed to proceed to any other business until it dispenses with an impeachment. The only exception is if you've got unanimous consent. It looks like the Senate has got unanimous consent to delay the hearings on the impeachment for a couple of weeks.
So Robert, just to continue on that question, so with the unanimous consent and well, I guess it'll go. It's with the unanimous consent. Are they able to continue working on the nominations that we have on the slide where we're at, or do they have to get the trial out of the way first?
They can proceed with some of these. It looks like they've agreed to proceed with the impeachment the week after next, I believe. So they got a couple of weeks to get some business done before they have to get impeachment out of the way.
Okay. One of the other questions that came through, and you see some articles in the news about it. Is there any validity to the news about trying to add new states, Puerto Rico, from trying to increase the number of senators from that standpoint?
There's a perennial debate about adding states, and the bargain that some have tried to arrange is we'll make DC a state if you make Puerto Rico a state, on the assumption that Puerto Rico would be Republican and DC would be Democrat. This is where my age and persistence in the swamp becomes a problem, because I've just never seen those debates get any further than just debates. So I just can't envision them really getting a lot of traction, especially with things so divided. That would be another really divisive issue to add to the plate of a bunch of already divisive stuff.
Well, speaking of divisive issues, what are your thoughts on Senators Hawley and Cruz and the 104, the other House Republicans that kind of objected to certifying the electoral votes? I think there's already some backlash on a couple of them. Just kind of what's your overall view on those?
Yeah. I think there have always been individuals who've objected to electors, and they've been to some degree successful in even getting what we saw at the last go around, which was a debate on the certification of the electors. This time, during that process, you had this violent attack on the Capitol. And so that's causing a real backlash against those objectors that you hadn't seen in the past. And I think, there's some political price to pay for what they did. I would suspect that there wouldn't be a political price at home. It'd be a political price in terms of, corporate political contributions. But I think time, 2 years is a long way between now and the election. I don't think a primary candidate would find this a useful tool to attack those incumbents, but maybe in the general. But again, so I think so much time will have passed between now and then that it might almost be forgotten. You can remind me of this when it's a hot topic in a couple of years, but that's as close as I'll get as talking about a topic that I really have no desire to talk about.
Okay. I guess we'll we'll go back to the executive branch. Obviously there was a lot of controversial presidential pardons as Trump was on his way out. The pardon is, some can say can be abused by both parties, Democrats and Republicans. Is there any thought to getting rid of it completely through a constitutional amendment or act of Congress?
No, I haven't heard that.
No.
There's a traditional process that's been observed. Pardons are processed through the Department of Justice, and a recommendation is made to the president. That's been relaxed. And so some return to that process is hoped, I think, but I don't think the prospects for eliminating that provision are low, if they exist at all.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit to go back to the economics and stimulus package, Robert, given the size of that package that's going to be coming through, is there any doubt, I think you touched on it a little bit at the beginning, is there any doubt that we're going to see tax increases just to cover the debt if that passes?
Yeah, that's a two-headed question, Nick. One is about taxes getting through, or the size of the stimulus. It's clearly enormous, and there's been, there's a group of bipartisan senators who had a big role in getting the most recent stimulus passed. And one of the big debates at that time was the size of these individual payments. And those individual payments go to go to a lot of individuals that may not necessarily be among the neediest. So, not only the size, but also the scope of those payments was in debate. Here, the Biden administration has proposed increasing those to meet the $2,000 target that was talked about in the last go around. Those bipartisan senators think that's too much and that it's not targeted. That's the kind of debate you'll see around this stimulus, trying to make sure that it's generous, because I think there's pretty good agreement that we're not out of the woods as far as the economy is concerned, but that it's targeted, at least a little bit more targeted than it has been. But your question about debt is an important one. I think what you're hearing from economists, Federal Reserve, Treasury, Yellen in her confirmation hearings, is that the risk of doing too little is greater than the risk of doing too much. Nonetheless, we're going to be left with this historic debt that I don't foresee us getting out of in the foreseeable future. In the past, we worried about interest on the debt crowding out discretionary spending, and that would creep up. Well, the amount of debt we're going to have after this, provided interest rates creep up even a little bit, that's going to increase the cost of servicing that debt. And it'll be as much as we spend on defense. It may be even as much as we spend on the rest on discretionary spending. And so I think at some point there'll be a reckoning where we have to rein in spending or find other sources of revenue to start paring down that debt, lest we, become a country that basically, pays mandatory benefit payments, Department of Defense, and interest on the debt, and that's about it.
Gotcha. Got a question that came here, Robert. You talked about earlier with some of the Biden's plan with fossil fuels and the pipeline. Any chance of Biden reconsidering the XL pipeline, given Canada's reaction, and then just in general, how much will he try to shut down fossil fuels?
Yeah. Well, I think he put a pause on leasing on federal lands today or yesterday for extraction of fossil fuels. He will have a hard time reinstituting the permits on the Keystone Pipeline. But, there's a rational case to be made that all that can be done in an environmentally sensitive manner. I'm looking for lightning to strike as I say that, or my daughter to scream from upstairs. But he's made pretty stiff commitments. He's going to have a balance that he's going to have to do. But he's got an incredibly ambitious agenda with respect to climate change, fossil fuels being one of the primary tools he's got to control. So I would see this as an area for aggressive regulation, ambitious restrictions, pretty consistently throughout the administration.
Yeah, one more here, Robert, and we'll see if to open up one last time for anybody. Obviously, the Trump had a love-hate relationship with the media. How is the Biden administration going to kind of tackle the media approach? If they continue to create an alternative reality or, provide any of the facts, I guess, how do you think his relationship is going to be with the media as we move forward?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to find a source of straight news on the television. Susan was asking me before we started, where I get my information. And I do try very hard to find primary sources, whether it be the White House, Congress, specific agencies. C-SPAN is a great source. Otherwise, you just get too much seasoning with your news. It's interesting to watch the media's relationship with the new administration emerge. I'm sure I'm saying something controversial, but you see the new press secretary sort of adopt some of the more hostile approaches to dealing with the media as she fields questions that she finds beneath her or beneath the president. So it'll take some discipline not to get back into that rut of a really negative relationship with the media. And on the other hand, the media's got to get back to a place where it calls it like it sees it. There's going to be lots of tendency to look the other way or forgive this administration, especially while it's in this honeymoon phase. But we need a media to be pretty critical. I think we need second guessing of the administration, because it's a major tool the American people have to hold the administration accountable. I hope that it's sort of interesting to watch as people criticize the Trump administration for having a bad relationship with the media. Every president has had a bad relationship with the media, even though I acknowledge Trump had a particularly bad one. Seeing that tendency reemerge in this administration will be interesting.
I'm surprised it was this long before bringing it up. But Robert, what do you see happening with free trade and tariffs with China, any other countries? Increasing, decreasing, a whole different approach?
No, I think the beef that the Biden administration has, or then candidate Biden had, with Trump's approach to trade was that it wasn't bilateral, that he didn't engage other international partners in trade disagreements with China or others. I don't think the underlying premise that we need to be tough with China in particular is going to be different. I think you'll see an anti-China perspective persist, perhaps strengthen during the Biden administration. I think you'll see some random tariffs on countries like Canada and Mexico. Those things will probably dissipate. You'll see the Biden administration go to war, small w, with China in alliance with the European Union, the UK, Canada and Mexico. I do see increasing restrictions against trade with or having your supply chain polluted with goods or services from Chinese state-owned companies like Huawei. I think the list of companies that are on the forbidden list is going to grow. So I think there's a unanimity that China is using its position with many of these companies to spy on and steal from American companies, especially those that have some national security mission or provide a national security good or service. So I think you'll see those kinds of provisions in law and policy proliferate. Hope that helps.
Is Robert also with we talked earlier about the debt side of things. What's your view on inflation risk under this administration, where we're at?
Yeah, well, I think right now inflationary pressures are going to remain low. It remains to be seen, because I think the economic conditions are such that our recovery is going to be slow and long term. So, I mean, I don't know if I can see very long into the future, but definitely within the year, I just don't see those percolating up. I'm not an economist. We've got a great one on staff in Diane Swank, so she'd probably be offended I even tried to answer that question, but that's my 2 cents. I hope this was useful to you. I really enjoyed it and appreciated the invitation.
Yeah, thank you, Mick and Robert, for presenting today. We really appreciate the program.